Some people move through chaos with the kind of steadiness that almost makes you wonder if they're living in a different reality. You've seen them when everyone else is spiraling. They're the ones whose pulse barely changes, whose voice stays level, whose decisions somehow get sharper instead of cloudier. And the funny thing is, they're not always the loudest or the most obviously confident. Sometimes they're the quiet ones in the corner who seem to understand something the rest of us missed. That invisible something is exactly what makes them so hard to ignore and even harder to truly understand. Because being calm isn't just about keeping a straight face or breathing slowly. It's a psychological architecture, a whole internal system they've built, consciously or not, that allows them to stay grounded when others get hijacked by their feelings. And here's the part most people overlook. Calm people aren't calm because life is easy for them. They're calm because their mind doesn't panic at the first sign of discomfort. They've built a relationship with stress that most people spend their entire life avoiding, and that difference shapes everything. One of the first things you notice about these people is that they don't treat emotions like emergencies. When irritation, fear, or uncertainty shows up, they don't act like something's gone terribly wrong. Their mind interprets it more like weather, uncomfortable, maybe inconvenient, but not catastrophic. They've learned the difference between feeling something and becoming it. The average person collapses those two into one, and that collapse is the exact moment calm disappears. But someone who stays steady recognizes that their emotional reaction is information, not a command. It's like the mind quietly saying, "This is what's happening inside you right now, not what you must do next." This ability creates a kind of mental space between stimulus and response. And in that space, they get options. That's why even when they're angry, they don't snap. Even when they're afraid, they don't freeze. Even when they're confused, they don't rush into the first bad decision that promises relief. They're not running from discomfort. They're actually watching it, which sounds simple, but is one of the hardest psychological skills you can develop. People like that also tend to be intimately aware of their own patterns. They know what triggers them, what drains them, what sends their mind into overdrive, and instead of pretending they're above it, they manage themselves the way a strategist manages their resources. Machiavelli would have appreciated them, not because they manipulate, but because they understand themselves well enough to avoid the impulsive choices that ruin clarity. He warned about leaders who let emotions steer them because it weakens their judgment. A calm person avoids that weakness, not through coldness, but through awareness. What makes this even more interesting is that calm people rarely perform calmness. They're not suppressing feelings for the sake of looking composed. Suppression creates pressure, and pressure eventually leaks out sideways, usually at the worst possible moment. Instead, they process emotions at the speed they arise. That's why they don't carry grudges for long, why they don't turn small annoyances into giant arguments, why they don't feel the need to constantly prove themselves. When something bothers them, they either handle it, understand it, or release it, but they don't drag it around, letting it ferment into something toxic. Another psychological trait they share is that they don't interpret everything as a threat. Modern life conditions most people to treat uncertainty like danger. A delayed text becomes rejection. A mistake becomes failure. A disagreement becomes disrespect. But calm individuals have a different interpretive filter. If someone speaks sharply, they consider that the person might be tired or overwhelmed. If a plan falls apart, they see flexibility instead of defeat. They're not naive. They just don't feed their brain a steady diet of worst-case scenarios. This is partly because they trust themselves more than the average person. When you believe you can handle whatever comes, you don't cling so desperately to control. You don't panic when things shift. You don't catastrophize when something goes off script. That self-trust is like an anchor. You may sway, but you don't drift. There's also a subtle social advantage that calm people naturally create. They make others feel safe. When someone consistently stays grounded, other people subconsciously adjust to their rhythm. They become the emotional reference point in the room. And there's a quiet power in that. People open up more around them. They admit things. They relax. They follow their lead without realizing it. It's not dominance. It's stability. And in a world where most people's internal state is constantly being yanked around, stability is magnetic. Another thing about these individuals is that they have a habit of zooming out mentally. When faced with a stressful moment, they instinctively widen the frame. Instead of obsessing over the immediate discomfort, they ask themselves what will matter hours from now, days from now, or years from now. This perspective shift shrinks problems down to their actual size. It's hard to freak out about a temporary setback when your mind can see it in context. Even small frustrations, like a rude comment or a sudden delay, lose their bite when held against the bigger picture. Zooming out isn't denial, it's prioritization. They also understand that reacting quickly isn't the same thing as responding wisely. Many people assume the fastest reaction is the strongest one. Calm individuals know the opposite. The strongest reaction is the one that comes after clarity, not before it. They're willing to take a moment, even a small one, to let their thoughts surface. And in that pause, their brain discards impulsive noise and keeps only what's essential. That's why their decisions look cleaner from the outside, not because they're smarter, but because they're less frantic. There's something else that often goes unnoticed. People who are consistently calm usually have a high tolerance for ambiguity. They don't demand immediate answers or resolution. They're okay sitting in the fog for a while. Ambiguity makes most people anxious because they interpret not knowing as something is wrong. But calm individuals treat uncertainty like a waiting room, not a battlefield. Instead of forcing conclusions, they allow more information to reveal itself naturally. That patience gives them insights that anxious minds rarely access. And then there's their relationship with identity. Most people latch onto roles, labels, or external perceptions to define themselves. Calm people tend to anchor their identity internally. Their sense of self isn't built from hyper-fragile foundations, like approval or appearance, or constant validation. Because they're not constantly scanning the world for signals about who they are, they're harder to rattle. Someone can criticize them or misunderstand them, and it doesn't send them into an existential tailspin. They may reflect on it, but they don't crumble under it. What you also notice is that these individuals are selective about what they give their attention to. They don't pour energy into every irritation or every pointless conflict. Attention is a currency for them. They invest it, they don't waste it. And because they don't waste it, they have more energy left for the things that actually matter. That alone reduces stress dramatically. When you stop feeding the small fires, they stop burning. There's a quiet discipline behind all of this. Calmness isn't luck. It's a pattern of choices. Choosing to pause instead of react. Choosing to listen instead of defend. Choosing to understand instead of assume. Choosing to release instead of cling. And those choices compound, shaping a mind that doesn't fracture under pressure, but settles, sharpens, and sees more clearly. But behind all these traits lies a deeper and more subtle mechanism, one that usually reveals itself only when you look closely at how these people think during moments of internal tension. Their mind doesn't jump straight to the story that hurts them the most. Most people do. The brain loves to sprint toward the narrative that confirms our fears, our insecurities, or the version of ourselves we haven't fully grown out of yet. But calm individuals resist that gravitational pull. When something unsettling happens, their first instinct isn't to invent a dramatic conclusion. They ask quieter questions. What else could this mean? What am I missing? Is this actually about me? Or am I personalizing something that isn't mine to carry? Those questions slow down the runaway train of emotion and force their mind to gather facts instead of fantasies. Because of this, They don't get dragged into emotional illusions, those quick, distorted interpretations we all create when we're stressed. They know the mind is capable of producing entire thunderstorms based on a single spark, so they treat early emotional reactions the way a scientist treats initial data: interesting, but not final. This ability gives them something incredibly rare: internal honesty. And internal honesty is one of the strongest foundations for calmness, because you're no longer fighting against your own mind. Their thought process also has a kind of emotional minimalism to it. They don't inflate small things into big things. They don't stack assumptions on top of assumptions until they've built a psychological skyscraper out of nothing. If someone cancels plans, they don't turn it into a rejection. If they make a mistake at work, they don't turn it into a catastrophe. They narrow the problem down to what's real and deal with that. No extra weight, no imaginary layers, just the actual situation. It keeps their mental landscape clear and prevents emotional clutter from accumulating. Another trait that stands out is how calm people regulate their internal pace. They don't let urgency dictate everything. Even in fast environments or stressful moments, they maintain a steady inner rhythm. Urgency is contagious. When others panic, people tend to sync with that energy. But calm individuals refuse to join the emotional stampede. They might move quickly when needed, but their mind stays slow in the best way. Slow like deliberate. Slow like intentional. Slow like someone who refuses to let adrenaline think for them. This makes them far better at reading situations accurately. When your mind isn't spinning, you notice details others miss. Subtle tones in a conversation, shifts in someone's mood, patterns beneath the surface. They're not mind readers, but they observe without the noise of overreaction, and this quiet observation helps them intervene before problems escalate. They can de-escalate conflict without making it obvious. Their presence alone often dissolves tension, because they're not adding fuel, just calm, oxygenated space where others can breathe again. Another interesting psychological pattern is that calm people often have a high degree of emotional independence. They're not constantly checking other people's reactions to decide how they should feel. They don't outsource their mood. If someone around them is anxious, they don't immediately mirror that anxiety. If someone's irritated, they don't automatically absorb that irritation. They have a kind of internal boundary that protects their emotional state. It's not coldness, it's ownership. They own their inner world instead of renting it out to every passing emotion in the room. This independence makes them less reactive in social situations, and it gives them a kind of social resilience most people never develop. Someone with this trait can sit with criticism without exploding, listen to opposing views without getting defensive, and stay open even when conversations get uncomfortable. Calmness isn't silence, it's staying present without being overwhelmed. A lot of this traces back to something deeper. Calm people don't need to win every moment. They don't need to prove they're right in every argument. They don't need to dominate every conversation. They don't need life to obey their expectations at all times. And that lack of neediness frees them. When you're not trying to force everything to go your way, you stop leaking stress. You stop battling reality. You stop treating normal human friction as some kind of personal attack. This acceptance, this internal okayness with things not being perfect, allows an incredible amount of peace to flow into their lives. But don't confuse that peace with passivity. The calmest people aren't passive at all. They simply conserve their strength for the moments that actually matter. They choose their battles with precision. They step in only when their presence will truly make a difference, not to soothe their ego. And because they're not constantly drained by impulsive reactions, they have more mental bandwidth when real challenges appear. That's why they often end up being the ones who take charge when things fall apart, not because they seek leadership, but because their mindset naturally fits those moments. Their calm also comes from an unusual relationship with time. They don't live in the past, replaying regrets. They don't get trapped in the future, forecasting worst-case scenarios. They operate mostly in the present, which sounds cliché until you notice how few people actually do it. They experience what's happening instead of wrestling with what might happen. This presence makes their decisions cleaner and their emotions more stable, because they're not mixing the current moment with yesterday's wounds or tomorrow's fears. If you pay attention, you'll see that they're also very intentional about their internal dialogue. Not the cheesy affirmations, but the subtle tone they use when speaking to themselves. Their inner voice isn't a drill sergeant barking orders or a critic listing flaws. It's firm when it needs to be, understanding when stress hits, and solution-oriented when things go wrong. That inner voice shapes how they navigate tough moments, and because their internal dialogue is steady, their external behavior follows. Something else that gives them a psychological advantage is that they don't confuse intensity with importance. Many people think the thing that feels the strongest must matter the most. A surge of anger feels important. A spike of fear feels urgent. A wave of insecurity feels meaningful. Calm individuals know that intensity is just energy. It doesn't determine truth. They've learned not to bow to emotional force. Instead, they wait to see which feelings persist once the initial surge passes. Only then do they act. That patience protects them from making high-stakes decisions in low-clarity moments. Another layer behind their calm is that they don't rely on external chaos to distract them from internal discomfort. A lot of people stay busy, loud, or constantly stimulated because silence makes them confront themselves. Calm individuals don't run from that confrontation. They've spent enough time with their own thoughts to understand them. They've sat through their internal storms. Once you stop fearing your own mind, the outside world loses much of its power to shake you. This ties into one more trait: emotional range. Calm people feel deeply, but they don't drown in what they feel. Their emotions move, but they don't take over. They experience sadness without collapsing, anger without exploding, excitement without losing control. This balanced emotional spectrum is what allows their calm to feel alive instead of numb. Some people mistake calmness for detachment, but real calmness isn't the absence of emotion. It's the ability to hold emotion without letting it spill everywhere. And perhaps the most surprising part is that this entire psychological framework often forms quietly over time, not through dramatic breakthroughs or life-changing philosophies, but through thousands of small decisions, tiny reframes, and subtle self-corrections. They get better at discomfort, one moment at a time, better at clarity, one realization at a time, better at letting go, one internal tug-of-war at a time. What emerges is a mind that doesn't chase every impulse, doesn't panic at every uncertainty, and doesn't crumble every time life tests its stability. A mind that stays grounded not because the world is calm, but because it has learned how to be calm within itself.